Pastor Stephen, welcome
Yes.
to the show.
Thank you.
I really appreciate you being here. This is really cool.
Yeah, I'm honored. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, I think I ought to share a little bit of our backstory because we've had this like fun run-in relationship where I didn't really know you, but we're friends with an entrepreneur named Ed Chan, who's a really close friend of mine, and he goes to your church.
Yeah, he does.
And we've run into each other with Ed a couple of times, actually probably 6, 7, 8 times.
Yeah.
And I've reached out to you to get some deep personal help on some issues that I've been dealing with. And so we've just kind of built a relationship in the hallways, and it's been really fun to engage with you and interact with you. And
we have a budding bromance. I think.
we do. Exactly. And I just thought it'd be really fun to bring you on the podcast because I think you have this really interesting perspective as a man of God, as a pastor of a church, but you're also a businessman building a company, building I'll call it a community of customers. You're in the business of people. You have this relationship with God that influences you and how you think about the world and life and strategy. And so I just thought that it was time, and I thought it would be a really cool conversation to have. So welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm excited about it. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things I'll start with is, as a pastor, you moved out to Southern California about 5 years ago or 6 years ago now.
Yeah.
And with the intention of building a community and building a fellowship here in Southern California. And remind me where you came from before this?
Yeah, so I grew up in Alabama and then lived in North Carolina for 12 years. So completely different world in Southern California. Grew up on a farm.
That's right.
2 miles down a dirt road. And so, never dreamed in a million years I'd be here. But, that's kind of where life's led me. So.
And how's Southern California treating you so far?
So far it's great. Our family loves it. Like, we think we're lifers, and our kids are Californian. They joke me because I still have my Southern accent, although it's fading. Like, it's really fading. It's hard for people to believe here, but my kids tell me all the time, like, Dad, you're losing it. And but my kids don't have it. They're Californian, and so we love it here. The weather's hard to beat. The beach year round, and just the diversity. Like, it's one of the most diverse places on the planet, and we really love that. So it's a great place.
Well, again, it's super amazing to have you here. And what I wanted to, I guess, start off with is talk a little bit about your journey as in this process of building your fellowship here in Southern California, coming out here with a small group of people with no followers. Essentially, I think about you as an entrepreneur, but an entrepreneur of God. And so I want you to explain a little bit about that process, that journey of starting up your practice, how you were, how you dealt with your challenges and how you built your following and some of the challenges that you faced.
Yeah, I think, it is a little bit of like, it's different than in the business world, but it's still, an entrepreneurial mindset. And I think, I didn't always know that about myself. I don't know that we really understand how we're wired until later in life. We start to look back and see patterns, and, it's like, wait a second, I've always kind of been starting stuff, whether it was, as a kid, like coming up with these ideas and these projects and things that, we were going to do. And you look back and you're like, man, yeah, I started that. And then you kind of see this pattern in your life. And so I think it took me a long time to just kind of realize how I was wired and how I operate. But as far as like, starting the church, that idea was birthed back in 2011. And we were actually in California for a wedding. My brother-in-law was marrying a girl, got married up in Pismo Beach. And so we were like most Southerners, we're like, I don't care to go to California. That's just the way most everybody on the East Coast thinks. Like, I didn't lose anything in California. And we
have a bad reputation. It's like a hate it or love it type of thing.
It's true. And most of it's just false. But anyway, that was my mentality. But we came out for a wedding, and so we came out and did vacation afterwards, and did the whole Hollywood thing and all that stuff. And we were just traveling from LA down to San Diego and drove through Irvine, and where our church is at now. and just saw the city that was just exploding with growth. And you could just tell from the freeway, like, this place is just, man, people are moving here like crazy. And so I just was intrigued, and I read about it on my phone on Google on that trip. And that's where I read, like, people were moving here from the Middle East, from Asia, from literally all over the world. And being a pastor, like, my next thought was, man, you know, there are people that are moving here. Like, I hope someone's sharing the gospel message, the Christian gospel message with these people that may have never heard. And again, kind of the entrepreneur, like, man, people have never heard, need to hear this. And so then I felt like, you know, on that trip, like, God kind of turned that around on me and said, well, you know, what if that was you? And my first thought is like, absolutely not. You know, I'm a Southerner. It would never work in Southern California. You know, people couldn't understand. You just think of all of these ideas in your head about why it wouldn't work. But then I would say over the next 2 to 3 years, that was a seed that just kept coming back and just became something that was just kind of gnawing at my heart and soul. And my wife and I discussed it from time to time. And make a long story short, it just became something that was just such a draw. We couldn't get away from it. And we just felt like we really think this is what God is calling us to do. And it sounds crazy, but there's just so many things pointing us in this direction. And so we knew it was something we didn't want to do alone. And so our next step was we need to find some people to come with us. And so we approached several families in our church, and we're like, hey, look, I know this is crazy. This is a big ask, but this is what we're doing. And we'd love for you to pray about this and move across the country with us. And we asked one guy to come on staff with us and 2 other families just to come and get jobs. And to our surprise, like, they said yes. And they were like, we're in. And wow. So they did that. And so we moved out, 4 families total, didn't know anybody in the city, and just began building relationships and eventually launched the church after that. So that's kind of the flyby version of what's happened.
That's amazing. And, you know, that reminds me that, you know, I think, I don't know if I would consider myself, a religious person by say, but I'm very spiritual. I feel very intuitive. I focus on that. Yeah, so I would definitely consider myself spiritual. We grow up as Indians in the Hindu religion, but I think the Hindu religion is an incredibly complex religion. And as a young kid growing up in America, you don't know everything about what's going on and why, right? We can get into religion if we really want.
That may be another podcast.
Yeah, maybe it's another podcast. But I love how you know, and as a man of God, like, you felt called to do something. Your mind played a ton of games on you of why that was a crazy idea. You could never do that. Like, right? You're leaving Alabama and all the people you know, like, and I think it's pretty amazing how you were able to connect to that and lean into it. And then people were following you.
Yeah.
People followed you.
Thankfully.
Thankfully.
Yeah.
Well, even if they didn't, you probably would have done it anyways.
Right. Absolutely. You know, there's that old saying, like, you know, how do you know if you're a leader? Like, if you look behind you and nobody's following you, then you're not leading. You're just taking a walk, right? And so it did help confirm things. That's true. Hey, people are on board with this. So, yeah.
So when what are some of the challenges? Let's talk about COVID, I suppose.
Yeah.
And some of the challenges that you've experienced now, getting together with your, what do you call it, fellowship?
Yeah, there's a lot of names. Sorry. Fellowship, church, flock.
Flock, okay.
Whatever.
So we'll call it fellowship. I don't want to be disrespectful. So, you know, what are the challenges that your fellowship has gone through? How have you been interacting with people? What are you seeing in the overall spirit of the fellow?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. Like, I can remember back before the pandemic, I can remember being in the gym here, actually at this building that we're videoing in. There's a gym, and I was there. I was working out. I know you can tell, obviously, and
stud.
And so I'm in there, and there's this news show that's on, and they're talking about the stock market at the time. So this is February 2020, and at the time the stock market was just up and to the right. I mean, just climbing. And they give the stock report, and the guy's just like, I mean, everything's to the roof. And he looks at his partner after he gives the report, and he goes, I mean, do you see anything that could slow down this stock market? And I'll never forget, the guy looked at him and he said, I don't see anything on the horizon that can slow this down. And of course, we look at that now and laugh. We're like, yeah, 2 weeks later, there was this pandemic that just swept across the world and, at least for the time, killed the stock market. But at the time, like, that's how I felt like our church was. Like, our first 2.5 years as a church, you expect some bumps in the road, but honestly, from the start, things just went according to plan. Like, we had this plan, we had this strategy, and it went according to plan. And people would ask me then, like, what's the most difficult thing you're facing? And there were obviously some difficulties, but sometimes I struggled. And then all that changed in 2020 when this pandemic hit. And, when you're in the business of like working with people and all of a sudden they can't get together anymore, I mean, that's a big deal. Mm-hmm. And so, we had to do, the word of 2020, we made a major pivot, right? And everybody's sick of that word, but we're still doing it. And so for us, it was, how do you continue to engage with your people? Because a church, the whole concept of a church is people getting together. Like, the root meaning of the word ecclesia is the Greek word for church, and it means those that are called out and gathered together. And so how do you continue to gather people together if you can't meet in person? And so, of course, we went online. I was mentioning to you before the podcast, like, every pastor all of a sudden had to become this, high-tech guru and stuff. And so we had to learn a lot in a really short amount of time and just try to find, how are ways that we can connect with our people, whether it's Zoom or Facebook Live or all of these different things. And so we did that for a season, and then things began to open up where we could at least meet outside. And so our church actually met in a soccer field for 11 months, and we just went completely portable, and we're outside, spread out, setting up a stage and stuff every single week in a soccer field in the middle of this neighborhood. And so we really had to get flexible to continue to, the hard thing was not to get so locked into what we always did, but to get locked into why we did it and what our goal was. And our goal was to gather people, whether it's digitally or whether it's in person, so that they could interact and so that they could hear the truth of this message that we're promoting. But yeah, so those are some of the pivots we made. It's been a long 1.5 years, just to be honest with you. It's been a long, difficult 1.5 years, but we're still here and we're still going.
Do you find that, I feel like within our companies, within any flock of people, let's call it that, I think being together, building culture with people, having that human interaction and connection, we were able to lean on those relationships we built pre-COVID during the COVID pandemic, right?
Absolutely.
As people are separated, you remember all of your camaraderie or your relationships that you built pre-COVID. But as we were separated, we started to see that sort of erode over time, and people were getting fatigued. Yeah. Did you see that in your community?
I'd love to say no, but absolutely. And, I think the church worldwide, or especially in America, the church is averaging 50% of its pre-COVID numbers as far as attending in person. And so one of the things that every pastor across America is going through right now is asking questions of, okay, we're trying to figure out, are some of these people, are they just nervous about coming to church? Are they upset about the way something was handled during the pandemic? Because, the last 1.5 years, we've had some major crises in America that were like these 50-50 crises that nobody agreed on, whether it's political crisis or racial stuff, or it's how the pandemic's handled, whether it's masks or vaccines or all those things. And so every pastor's, trying to figure out where their people are. Are they not attending because of fear of COVID? Are they not attending because they're just not going anywhere? And so
they have an opinion about one of these subject matters and disagrees with other, right?
And so probably the same thing in business. You really, someone told me recently, crisis exposes where people are as far as their allegiance to your organization. And so you find out, well, are they really on board? Or were they, just kind of coming and now things have changed and so they're not involved anymore? So yeah, I would say, to answer your question, yeah, we've definitely seen that take place in our churches, where whether it's leaders or whether it's people who are attending, trying to figure out where people are since COVID started. And
as sort of the leader and as the pastor, how do you stay neutral to these political or, masks or this or that, like all these different situations, right? People maybe look to you for advice or guidance and almost expect you to have an opinion.
Yeah.
Are you allowed to have an opinion? Do you not have an opinion? And I'd love to share that from a leadership perspective.
I am allowed to have an opinion.
And of course you're allowed to have an opinion, but does that serve you, or are you thoughtful? Like, do you have to be sensitive to that?
And it depends on the church. There are some pastors that have been very vocal on politics, and very vocal on everything this year. We actually and we try to coach our church through these things. And I think in any organization, like, you always want to be talking about why you're doing what you're doing. And people don't care so much about what you're doing, but why you're doing it. And we just talked a couple of weeks ago in the message about why we do things, and why we do them the way we do them. And so we talked about the gospel, which is our core message as Christians, that comes from the Bible. And the gospel is just simply this fact. It's a declaration that Jesus, that he died, he was buried, he resurrected, and he's now been declared the supreme ruler of the universe. Like, that is in a core, that is the gospel message. And we believe from that message, that declaration of an event that happened, that everything is now different because of that. And so that's at the heartbeat, should be the heartbeat of every church. Sometimes that gets muddled, right? And so we just talked to our church about this and said, look, there's a lot of different opinions on politics. But that's not, our calling is not to speak to that. Now, we can give values and things that we believe should be, in the way that you see politics. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the life of Jesus himself, there's so many times where they tried to pull him into politics. Well, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? And if you look within his group of disciples, of followers, he actually had a guy that worked for the Roman government, and he had a guy that was trying to overthrow the Roman government. And they were both in the same group. And so we just told our church, like, do you think there was some conflict in there? Absolutely. Okay. And so our main thing is not to speak to, politics and those kind of things. Are there values that Christianity has? Absolutely.
Sure.
And we want to speak to those, but it's difficult sometimes, because obviously I have my opinion of politics and things like that. But we try to keep the main thing in our church.
Yeah, that's so good. What do you see as some of the things that people are struggling with right now? I mean, people come to you for help, advice, coaching. I did. Yeah. And so, there's a lot of things that people are going through psychologically, emotionally. What are some of the patterns that you get to see show up? And then why do you think those things are showing up right now in this time of the world? And what can we do differently? And what can we learn from that?
Yeah, I think it is interesting being in the seat of a pastor, because you interact with so many different people, and yet you realize that there's common themes of problems that people have. And some of those were the same before the pandemic, and they're the same now. And some of those have, they're different now that we're in the pandemic. I would say two that stand out in my mind, the things that I hear the most. One is relational problems, whether it's husband and wife. That's obviously a big one. And I don't think the pandemic caused those problems.
I don't know about that. We're all cooped together in small little spaces for long periods of time. So I'm not surprised about that.
I think that, one of the things we told our church early on in the pandemic is a crisis doesn't cause problems, but it does reveal.
Yeah, it exposes.
It exposes some of the issues already there. It's kind of like, that tea bag that's in that hot tea, the hot water doesn't cause that flavor to come out of the tea. It just kind of draws out what's already there. And when we get put in crisis, it kind of pulls out what's inside of us. And if that's selfishness or ego or those kind of things, like when we're under pressure, we don't do what we think we should do. We just do what's inside. Like, we tell our kids, like if our kids say something bad, we'll say, they're like, well, I got mad. Well, you got mad and it came out what was in your heart and in your mind. You just didn't filter it, right? And I think that's what's happening in a lot of marriages. Some of those things that were already underlying issues, they got pressed on during COVID. And so it came to the surface. They're spending time with each other, all the time, and those kind of things came out. So I definitely see relational issues. One of the things that's popping up now more so than ever is anxiety with people. And, that was something that pre-COVID you definitely saw. But man, it seems like it's almost an epidemic or pandemic in anxiety right now.
Anxiety caused by work stress, life stress,
I think right now it seems
Just uncertainty in general.
Yeah, honestly, it seems to be all of those things. And I think that's why people are struggling with it, because maybe pre-COVID, they could pin it down and say, it's my finances that's causing it. It's my work. Now it's those things, and it's uncertainty. It's, I read this morning that this pandemic that we're in has turned from like this acute crisis that almost rallied people like, hey, come on, let's go, let's do this, to now it's turned into this prolonged crisis that it's a chronic crisis that's just ongoing. And that's more exhausting, because where's this thing end?
Where's this end?
And so I think people are, all of those things together, there's a lot of anxiety.
We can all buy into that.
Absolutely.
What is your advice to that? Like when people come to you say, Pastor, I'm exhausted.
Yeah.
I'm feeling tired. I'm feeling stressed. There's so much uncertainty, which, I'm always in the school of thought there's really never any certainty, but
sure.
But I get it. Like, what do you say to those people?
Yeah.
What is the advice?
Anxiety is something like I've never really struggled with anxiety in my life until I would say probably in this last year. And really? I found even myself dealing with some anxiety. And so I've had to, I think of myself, I've really had to, some of the things I've always done and always thought, I've had to rethink in a way, at least in my habits and the way I do things. I think we're both Enneagram 3s, and I feel like my habit before in life has always been, I can outwork any problem, right? I can outwork it. I can work longer. If I need to do 15 hours a day, we can make it happen. Whatever we need to do to make it happen.
I don't know that at all.
It's almost like you outwork your anxiety to get to a point of feeling good. And I know for me personally, there was a point in the middle of this pandemic where I just came to this realization, I don't know if I can outwork this. And that was a humbling thing to get to.
I love that.
But I think what I've been sharing, with my people is, for us, one, you have to be grounded in something. When you're not grounded, that's where anxiety starts to come in, and you're unstable. And so for us, obviously, our grounding is our relationship with God. God's always been here. He always will be here. This isn't his first pandemic. It won't be his last. All the things that he said are still true. And so you have to anchor ourselves towards what is true and what is stable.
So good.
And consistently go back to that. When you're unstable, it just feels like everything's out of line. And the other thing is just, for me, putting in rhythms in my life, healthier rhythms. And I think that's a part of stabilizing yourself too. And so for me, that's been, embracing limits. And that's really, really hard for an Enneagram 3 to embrace limits and say, you know what, I'm going to take this time to actually rest. Because, for me, working is a hobby, it feels good to be productive. And so setting apart time to rest, setting apart time to actually just withdraw and focus on what I believe. And for me, that looks like, every morning for 45 minutes to an hour I take time and I spend in my Bible, and I spend time praying, and I just spend time thinking through the things that are grounding to me. Mm-hmm. And so those are some of the same things that I'm preaching over and over and over again to our people.
I love that. And one of the pillars of the Rich Equation concept is daily routine. Mm-hmm. And what I just heard was, in a time of uncertainty, how do we go back to looking for truth, right? And for me, I was doing more exercise, walks, connecting with nature, really trying to slow things down and find space, right? Not consuming, not watching the news, and finding more information to digest and consume. So I think that's pretty powerful, that you're able to use routine. Do people, you're a man, you're a pastor, people expect you to have the answers, I'm sure, or come to you all the time. And I know that I've had a couple of discussions with you. How do you not make other people's problems yours? Yeah. And I think that in leadership, at least for me, that's always been really challenging, in jumping to the conclusion, right? Mm-hmm. Every problem is our problem. Yeah. Solving everybody else's problems. And I won't say that completely universally, like we don't always do that, but there's definitely a proclivity of owning it. Yeah. and it's not healthy. You can't absorb everyone's problems, especially because they're trying to get answers or get clarity or understand references, etc. But like, how do you process that, and what has been your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a man, so I want to fix stuff, right? And, going back to the Enneagram, I'm a 3, so I like fixing stuff. Let's get a solution. Let's get a strategy in place. Let's go ahead and do this. Why do we need to sit here and talk about it when there's an answer, And that's one of the things I had a tough time learning that early on in my marriage. I've been married for 15 years now. And so obviously I learned it at some point, but my wife would come to me and she would just start talking to me about something that was bothering her. And like halfway through the conversation, I already had it solved, and I just wanted to tell her what it was. And she's like, I don't want you to solve it. I just want you to listen. And in my mind, I'm like, well, what's the point of listening if we can solve it, So I had to learn that.
Husbands everywhere. That is the lesson of the day.
I had to learn that the hard way. But the same thing is true with people in my church, because obviously I have opinions and I see things and I see patterns and I see if they would do things differently in their life, it would go differently. That we would solve this problem and that kind of thing. But that's not always what people are looking for, and that's not always the best way to approach it. And obviously I can't take on, like you said, everybody's problem. And again, that's something I've been learning, I think even more so during the pandemic. My wife and I have talked a lot about this concept of what's called overfunctioning, of going beyond what we should do and how we should be involved in taking on people's problems. And I think for me, that's a part of embracing my limits again, of realizing I only have a small portion of time. And so, yes, I need to love everyone. I need to care for everyone. I need to be present when I'm engaged in a conversation, but also realizing I can't take home every problem and fix it and go back to them with a solution or walk them through every problem. So I think realizing that I can't overfunction has been a really big thing for me. I don't know if I fully answered that question.
Yeah, no, it does. And two things come to mind actually, because I've experienced this in the last year or two, that I've really had to learn to what I call co-create. Co-create solutions, co-create problem solving, learn to delegate more, and not selfishly just worrying about yourself. Like you were mentioning, like learning how to create boundaries in a healthy way means that you're not solving everybody else's problems for them, but you're co-creating the solution with them, saying you need to now take accountability for the next 5-6 steps. And that's a process in its own. But there's a lot of ego that shows up for us as leaders in being able to solve people's problems, in growing companies, feeling good about solving problems. Does that happen to you? Are you victim to that in your journey of growing your pastorship, or solving other people's problems and making that feel really good? Like how do you deal with the mind component of that?
Yeah, I think and that kind of goes back to your other question. When people are coming to you for asking questions, it's obviously because they respect your opinion. And so it's easy to fall in this mindset of like, oh yeah, I'm indispensable. And, and that's a temptation in and of itself, to just step in and solve their problems, whether it's people in our church or our staff or our volunteers. And I'll just go back to that for a second, because I think this goes across the board in church or business, whatever you're in. I found myself solving so many problems, whether it be for our staff or whatever. And because, maybe there was something that I could do it at a certain level, and maybe this person was doing it like a 75% level of that. And I just didn't want it to suffer, and so I just kept doing it. And I had to get to the point of realizing, man, like you said, I've got to let this drop a little bit. And that hurts my ego. That hurts my pride, because, for instance, in our church, maybe it's our online streaming. So we stream our services, and so maybe someone else takes it over, and I'm looking at the online service afterwards, and I'm like, oh man, that quality is not what it ought to be. And so the easy thing is to step back in and say, dude, you got to start doing this, you got to start doing that. But being willing to let something suffer for a little bit so that person can grow into it, and I don't just take back over ownership of it. Anyway, that's a big lesson that I'm still learning, but getting better at. But to get to your question of ego, I mean, I think that's a human struggle, right? Deep inside, I believe that every single person, whether they admit it or not, there's something in us that wants to be worshiped. There's something in us that wants to be worshiped. That's why social media is so enticing. That's why everybody checks their social media 100 times a day or more. And that's why influencers on social media are, people look up to them, because we all have a desire inside of us to be worshiped. Now, from a Christian perspective, we believe that worship's due to God, right? And so, but we all have that tendency of wanting to be liked, of wanting to be elevated, of wanting to be praised. And so any form that comes, if it's on social media or, someone, for a pastor, like after service, oh, that was the best message I've ever heard, whatever it is, it does. It goes straight.
The drip.
Yeah, it goes straight to your ego, and I think it's one of those things. I've had enough pastors over time that have kind of tried to help mentor me and warn me about those things, because it's almost like a poison, right? You start to drink that, you start to believe your own headlines, and you really start to think you're so much more awesome than you really are, or worthy of all the praise you should be getting. And so for me, honestly, it's so hard to have the right motives, even as a pastor. And if people think, well, you're doing this for God, shouldn't all your motives be pure? I heard a guy the other day say, you know what, it's easy to be doing stuff in the name of God, and actually he called it, you're photobombing Jesus, where it's like
I love that.
You're doing this stuff
right.
for Jesus, and in the background you're throwing up the peace sign, making sure you're getting in the video or the picture, and it creeps up on you. And so anyway, it's a long way of answering getting to your question. My wife helps with that. She's really good at, we are
human. We are human. And so you still have natural instincts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so my wife helps. She'll be honest with me. I'm like, babe, just be honest with me. Do you see this in me right now? And she'll be upfront and honest and like, you know what? Yeah, I do, or whatever. And so that definitely helps. And then I've got other men in my church that are around me. I think Ed's one of those guys. Mm-hmm. He's very blunt. And
he's very blunt.
I need
especially
that.
with me too.
And I think leaders need people like that in their life, that, you can't just have a bunch of yes people around you. You need somebody that's not going to tear you down.
Even a pastor.
Absolutely.
So good.
Who's going to give you a kick in the pants and say, hey, dude, man, I just see this in your life right now, and I just want to be honest with you. And have a person that, like Ed's not scared to say that. And we have that relationship where he can say those things. I've given him that freedom. And I think having those key people in your life are huge. And then, of course, for me, my relationship with God, going back to God's word. And that's a filter for me, because it constantly is reminding me that it's not about me, it's about him and what he's called me to do. So I don't know, maybe an answer's in there somewhere.
Good. I find that there's also, I'm going to comment on this a couple different ways. I think that I've also been pretty lucky to have a group of people who are not shy to be blunt with me. And part of why I wanted to have this podcast forum and build this community is that, there are groups of people who are having these honest conversations and calling people out and talking about these things vulnerably. Like, how can we have it more of a public forum? But I also am good about reaching out to people and saying, like, I need you to give me the truth right now. Like, you otherwise may not have, but I'm giving you full permission to just rip into me on what's showing up for me and how am I behaving in, right? And so I've been pretty lucky on that. The other thing that I see on an ego perspective is, you kind of mentioned, is like when people come up to you and say good things. So there's a couple things that show up. For me, being able to, like, I don't really take positive criticism well. And I started realizing that recently, is that when people give me positive criticism, like, oh, you did a great job, or thank you so much, or like, whatever. Yeah. I actually wasn't accepting or receiving of that. And I think within my own subconscious, I was like, well, duh.
Why are you telling me this? I already know it. Right?
Yeah. That was one of the things that started showing up, and I actually had to learn how to be more graceful and say, like, thank you, because selfishly I wasn't giving receipt of that praise. And I think a lot of people do that. And I don't know if I really noticed that before. Yeah. And the second thing is, I think there are a ton of day-to-day behaviors, and you just mentioned social media. For me, it's email. is there are a ton of day-to-day behaviors that we go to that feed our ego, that if we can learn and be aware of those specific daily activities and say, how is this serving me? Am I going to my email because I really need to work on my email? Or am I going to my email because I think there's a problem in there that I'm going to be able to solve and it's going to make me feel really, really good?
Yeah. You get that little dopamine rush.
It's a dopamine rush. And for me, like, there's so many little things that I've started to be aware of how do I eliminate those things out of my life? And if I'm going to do it, I just have to go in much more aware, right, of how I interact. I'm still a victim to it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I'm thinking about this quote that I heard recently, and I think it kind of goes in line with this. The guy said, if you let compliments go to your head, you'll also let criticism go to your heart. And it's kind of this double-edged sword with our ego, where what people say about us and our successes, if we value that too much, it just goes to our head, right?
Yeah.
But the flip side of that is when we're criticized, whether somebody criticizes our success or they criticize or point out a failure, and we all have those, it can go to our heart and just completely cripple us. And both of those are really dangerous things, but they tend to live on like the flip side of the same coin. Yeah,
it's so good. So this is the mindset series, and so what are you guys talking about now? Like, what are you communicating to the fellowship now in terms of what's the message going on right now?
You mean like going forward in this pandemic, or
just in the last few weeks? Like, what are you finding yourself talking a lot about right now?
Well, we just finished. So in our church, in our setting, we like to do series, and so we feel like, that just kind of helps people get involved and get engaged, and you can really drill down on a subject, or sometimes it's a book of the Bible that we want to dive into, and so we really try to think ahead of time and figure out, like, okay, where do we need to go in this period of time? And then sometimes in this past year, we've just had to pivot real quickly. But we just finished like a 10-week series this summer on the gospel, which again is our foundation, our core as Christians. And so really trying to draw people back to why we do what we do, really trying to strip away a lot of the, just kind of the trappings or the extras, and like, hey, look, this is who we are. This is what we believe. This is why we do what we do. And so, and I think, again, you can apply that that goes across the spectrum, business, culture, and everything, of just getting back to that why. And I think that's, you got to really make sure your core is fully engaged in that, no matter what you're involved in. And so then we're actually, this Sunday and next Sunday, we're just kind of in a one-off, it's not really a series, got a couple standalone sermons. And then we've got coming up, we're doing a 3-week series on mental health. And so it's kind of something that maybe the church culture has avoided for a long time.
Yes.
And I think is coming around to a little bit more. It's almost like, I think a lot of pastors have thought, well, we'll let mental health people deal with that, or, mental health's not really a big issue. But you actually find in the Bible a lot of stuff about mental health and your mind, and your mind's just kind of its own battlefield. So how do you navigate what's going on between your ears? And so, that's
how do we navigate that?
You have to come to the series.
I may have to.
You have to be there. It starts September 26th at Grace City Church. So
I love it.
Check it out.
Yeah, I wanted you to have the opportunity to talk about Enneagrams, because I learned about Enneagrams a couple of years ago, but I never really got into it. But you're like big into that. And you've identified both of us as Enneagram 3, and I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think I'm 2, but I'm not sure exactly. Like, I think I'm 3 and 7 or 3 and 11 or something. Anyways, like, during COVID, what I realized was we really had to get deeper on who we were as business people, as teams, as individuals. And, there's a lot of different tools out there to, like, personality tests. Why do you like Enneagram? What is an Enneagram 3? Let's talk about that. But, like, why do you like Enneagram, and, what can people learn from that?
Yeah, I got introduced to it a couple years ago, and I think for anybody that's listening and wants to check it out, it's another personality test. It's been around for years and years and years, but just recently, I'd say in the last 5 or 10 years, some guys really kind of made it popular again, and if I added some things to it. I like it. just because it seems to simplify things, and it seems to me, in my experience, it seems to be the most accurate. Like I've done the DISC stuff, I've done Myers-Briggs, and I love all those things. I think they're really neat and helpful. They help me know how to better relate to other people. For years, I thought everybody saw the world like I see it, and I'm just like, why can't they do it the way I do it? Like, I would see, we had come across an obstacle and I'm like, all right, let's go, let's conquer this mountain. And then other people are like analyzing it to death. And I'm like, why is this guy doing this? Just come on. And then you start realizing, well, different people see the world differently. And so it's really helped me with that. My wife is the guru. Like, she's licensed in it and everything. So
really?
Yeah, you need to bring her on sometime. She'd diagnose all of us and stuff.
I mean, that stuff is so valuable, so important. And like you said, to understand how people show up in the world really helps you interact with them much better. Enneagram, you said Myers-Briggs, DISC, we use predictive index within the company. All those personality tests really help us have much healthier interactions with people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's so fun.
Yeah, and I think, I won't go into all of it, but it's interesting because the Enneagram basically says it's like the others. Every number has its strengths and its weakness, right? And the Enneagram really focuses on kind of core motivation. And so, I don't know, it's more so than any other test. It really makes you feel vulnerable. The 3 is the achiever. Like, we want to achieve, we want to produce, but kind of the dark side of the 3 is that we want people to see us achieving, right? And so sometimes for a 3, the fear of failure or the fear of not being seen as an success can be a core motivation. And so, figuring out, okay, how do I address this? How do I know this about myself? And then how do I relate to others that, feel differently about things? So I'd encourage anybody to check it out. A guy who's written a lot on it lately is a guy named Ian Cron. And he's got a book out called The Road Back to You.
So good.
And
we'll put it in the show notes.
He really does a good job of breaking everything down, more so than I can do.
So I'll ask you one question, and then I'd actually like to close off with a prayer.
Oh, fantastic.
If you'd want to.
Yeah.
What does richness mean to you?
Oh, man, that's a big one. I would say for me, I think first of all, it's knowing God. I would sum it up in 3 things. I would say it's knowing God, loving people, and living out God's purpose for your life. Knowing God, loving people, living out God's purpose for your life. I think that Jesus himself talked about living the rich life, and a lot of people don't know that, but he talked about those that come to him. He says, I'll give you life and life abundantly. And what that simply means is I'll give you life and life richly, like an overflowing. And obviously some people have taken that and twisted it and be like, hey, if you believe enough, you'll become a millionaire or whatever. Right. And that's not what he's saying, but he is saying that you'll have a rich life. And then he goes through scripture and his teachings are basically like, hey, this is how you navigate life. And so from a Christian perspective, we believe you either, come along the ways that he taught and follow those ways and live the way that he taught life, or you try to go out and figure things out on your own, which usually doesn't work out well. So to sum up what he said and sum up what I believe about it, it's knowing God, which I think every person, it was created to know God. I think we're created in the image of God. I think we have this desire within us, whether we grew up in America or somewhere in the jungles of Africa, like there's this desire to know God that just screams out from us. But then also, I think loving people, I think that's what we were put here to do. We're not just here to live on an island. It's in community with other people. And at the end of our life, when we look back, the truth is, when I'm on my deathbed, I'm not going to look back and be like, honey, play those great sermons that I preached, or, let's talk about all these things. Nobody's doing that. It's not going to be how much money you made. It's all going to be about your relationships, right? Those are the things that mean something during the end. Those are the pictures that you look back on. So the relationships, and then living out God's purpose for your life. So what is it that God put me here on this earth for? The book of Ephesians in the Bible talks about that God created us as his workmanship, or his masterpiece. And before we were ever born, he ordained good works that we're supposed to do. And so as a 3, I love that. Like, God's given me something to do. I've got responsibility. I've got a meaning. I've got a purpose on this earth. And so, I would say all 3 of those things for me are what it means to live a rich life.
That was awesome. Let's close up.
Let's do it. All right. So we're praying?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
You lead.
All right. All right. Let's pray. God, we love you. And Lord, we just thank you so much for this opportunity. I thank you for this conversation with my friend Ashish. And Lord, I thank you for everybody listening today. Lord, I have no idea who they are. They may be wondering who this guy is talking to them right now. But Lord, I don't believe in coincidence. I think obviously that, Lord, there's purpose in everything. And God, even the fact that they're listening today, there's a reason behind that. And Lord, if they're still listening to this point, no doubt, God, you have a purpose in this. And God, I just pray right now that you would help them to know that first of all, there is a God, and there's a God that loves them. There's a God that cares for them. There's a God that sent his son on the cross to die for them. And Lord, I'm sure maybe for some there's a lot of questions about what that even means and why his son even died and all of that. But God, I just pray that you would help them to search out these things. Lord, I pray that they would reach out to someone and just begin asking questions, begin having a conversation. And Lord, I just pray for their personal lives, God, their relationships that can be, God, so tricky, so much harder to handle than even a business. But Lord, I pray for their relationships at home, God, their spouse, their kids, and other relationships in their life. And Lord, I pray for their purpose. God, I just pray that you would help them to know meaning and purpose in life. And Lord, if they are dealing with some of these relational problems and anxiety, or God, whatever it is they're facing, to know that, God, there are people in their life that care about them, that love them. And most of all, there's a God that cares for them and loves them. And God, we pray these things in the name of your son, Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, brother.
Yeah, man.
That was so good.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Time.
Enjoyed it. Good stuff.